According to sources, Prince William allegedly had Camilla's nephew escorted out of Windsor Castle, and the most noteworthy aspect of the whole affair wasn't even the removal of the nephew from the castle. It was the fact that Princess Anne was right there witnessing everything, and her reaction was essentially just a silent, approving nod. Prince William immediately ordered Queen Camilla's grandchildren removed from the palace. Uniformed royal security personnel escorted the children across the cobblestone streets and out of the palace gates before their scheduled visitation time ended. The grandchildren of Queen Camilla, who remain unnamed in official security logs but comprise Eliza, Gus, and Louis Lopes, along with Lola and Freddie Parker Bowles, had crossed from the permitted guest zones into the deeply restricted, private state and banquet spaces directly managed and controlled by the Prince and Princess of Wales. The children had been found running through the high-security corridors, their shouts and laughter bouncing off the walls of halls meant only for constitutional duties and the private life of the immediate heirs to the throne. There were no nannies following them, no royal protection officers assigned to their movement, and no adult supervisors in sight. They were completely unmonitored, roaming a fortress that houses centuries of state secrets and the daily operations of the future king. At that exact moment, Queen Camilla herself was completely oblivious to the breach, insulated deep within a distant drawing room, casually chatting with her daughter, Laura Lopes. The physical intrusion was immediately met with a counterforce from the core bloodline of the monarchy. James, the 18-year-old Earl of Wessex and son of Prince Edward, happened to be navigating the private corridor when he intercepted the running children. James did not hesitate or defer to their status as the Queen's family. Standing his ground as a titled Windsor, James blocked their path and firmly informed the children that they had violated a restricted zone and must leave the area immediately. The eldest grandson of Camilla, accustomed to years of unchecked access under the indulgent reign of King Charles III, openly ignored the teenage Earl, attempting to brush past him under the assumption that his grandmother's crown granted him total freedom of movement. However, James remained unyielding, standing like a wall in the historic corridor. Standing only a few feet away, watching the entire interaction with a piercing, analytical gaze, was Princess Anne, the Princess Royal. Anne, the ultimate enforcer of palace discipline, observed the grandson's arrogant dismissal of her nephew James. Without saying a word to the children, Princess Anne signaled the reality of the new regime. It was not Prince William who initiated the physical expulsion. It was Princess Anne who turned to the royal security team and coldly commanded them to clear the palace. James, displaying a level of stoic maturity that mirrored his senior relatives, immediately processed the paperwork, signing off on the official internal security incident log as the protection officers stepped in to escort the bewildered children to a waiting vehicle. The immediate and clinical expulsion of the Parker Bowles and Lopes children from the private corridors of Windsor Castle was not an isolated act of frustration, but rather the explosive culmination of a deep systemic crisis that has been quietly eroding the traditional boundaries of the British monarchy for years. Under the indulgent and highly sentimental oversight of King Charles III, the line separating the constitutional royal family from Queen Camilla's private, non-royal relatives had become dangerously blurred. When Charles and Camilla married, the palace machinery embarked on a massive, decades-long public relations campaign to normalize her presence and soften public skepticism. Part of that strategy involved intentionally weaving her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, along with her 5 grandchildren, into the visible fabric of the monarchy. They were systematically invited to high-profile family gatherings, prominently featured in official holiday photographs, and treated by the king as though they were legitimate members of the extended Windsor circle. However, this deliberate strategy of social integration eventually morphed into an institutional headache, creating an unprecedented overreach that Prince William and Princess Anne viewed as an existential threat to the dignity of the crown. For years, these 5 grandchildren, Eliza, Gus, Louis, Lola, and Freddie, enjoyed an extraordinary level of proximity to the center of British sovereign power, despite being regular, private citizens. They hold no royal titles, possess no royal bloodline, have no official role within the state, and do not carry the prestigious Her Royal Highness or His Royal Highness prefixes. Yet, because King Charles treated them with the same affection as his own flesh and blood, a dangerous culture of entitlement began to take root within the Parker Bowles' younger generation. They grew accustomed to treating historic fortresses like Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace not as guarded symbols of state authority, but as private, domestic playgrounds where the ordinary rules of security and decorum did not apply. This institutional erosion reached its absolute zenith during the planning of the king's coronation, an event that nearly triggered an internal constitutional revolt behind palace walls. Queen Camilla, emboldened by her impending elevation, aggressively pushed to have her own grandchildren completely displace the traditional roles reserved for the king's actual blood descendants and the children of the high nobility. In an unprecedented move that left senior courtiers and Prince William deeply unsettled, there was a concerted effort to strip Prince George and the other young royal Vungtone of their historic positions as pages of honor, intending to replace them entirely with Camilla's non-royal grandson. Although a partial compromise was eventually forced by senior palace advisors to save Prince George's rightful historical placement, the mere fact that Camilla had attempted to elevate her commoner family over the legitimate heirs to the throne set off massive alarm bells for the Prince of Wales. The long-term consequences of this unchecked blurring of lines quickly manifested in a highly toxic and embarrassing way among the British public. Because King Charles had allowed these children to occupy such prominent, highly visible spaces at major state and religious events, an alarming portion of the younger British generation, lacking a deep understanding of rigid royal genealogies, grew completely confused. Tabloid coverage and social media algorithms began routinely misidentifying the Parker Bowles and Lopes children, with young observers frequently addressing them with the formal title of Your Royal Highness, or calling them princes and princesses in public spaces. To Prince William, this was an unmitigated disaster for the long-term survival of the monarchy. It diluted the unique, sacred nature of the royal bloodline and created the false impression that the inner circle of the British crown was expanding into a sprawling, messy, multi-family conglomerate filled with private citizens who possessed immense social privilege but absolutely zero public accountability. This toxic blurring of lines is precisely what set the stage for the dramatic confrontation in the western private apartments of Windsor Castle. When the children were discovered running completely wild through the highly restricted, state-sanctioned zones, their total lack of parental or professional supervision was a damning indictment of the casual arrogance that had entered the palace under Camilla's wing. While Queen Camilla was comfortably insulated in a nearby drawing room, enjoying an uninterrupted afternoon of casual gossip and tea with her daughter Laura Lopes, her grandchildren were actively violating the sovereign security of the future king's household. They had no security detail assigned to them because they were not royal, and they had no private nannies or chaperones present because their family had grown so comfortable with the palace environment that they treated it with casual familiarity. They ran through historic corridors that house priceless state artifacts and act as the sensitive nerve centers for the Prince of Wales's daily constitutional operation. When James, the Earl of Wessex, stepped forward to defend the boundaries of his family's household, the oldest grandson's defiant attempt to push past him proved that the children no longer recognized the authority of the actual royal line. They genuinely believed that their grandmother's status as queen consort granted them an automatic immunity that superseded the rules of the house. The immediate, unflinching intervention of Princess Anne and the swift administrative execution by the young Earl of Wessex shattered that illusion in an instant. By ordering the royal security team to physically remove the children from the premises without allowing them to eat the lunch that had been prepared or even say goodbye to their grandmother, Princess Anne and Prince William sent a shuddering shockwave through the entire court. It was a calculated, brutal reassertion of institutional discipline over domestic indulgence. The signing of the official security incident log by James was the final, devastating touch, turning a family squabble into a matter of permanent state record. For years, King Charles had used his sovereign authority to bend the rules of the monarchy, slowly diluting the royal brand to accommodate the family of the woman he loved. But on that afternoon at Windsor Castle, the future king and the hardest-working member of the family explicitly demonstrated that the era of royal indulgence was over. The boundaries that had been allowed to blur for over 2 decades were instantly snapped back into place with maximum force, leaving Queen Camilla's family to face the cold, unforgiving reality of their true status as ordinary citizens who had overstepped their bounds. The echo of the security vehicle's tires gripping the gravel as it sped away with her grandchildren had barely faded before Queen Camilla, consumed by absolute fury, marched toward the private study of the Prince of Wales. The sheer humiliation of the act had shattered her usual polished composure. She had been left standing in her drawing room, blindsided and utterly disgraced before her own daughter, Laura Lopes, after learning that her flesh and blood had been rounded up like common intruders and cast out of the gates of Windsor Castle. Confronting Prince William directly, the Queen Consort did not hold back her intense displeasure, unleashing a torrent of bitter grievances. She fiercely attacked William for what she described as an unnecessarily cruel, rigid, and clinical overreaction toward innocent children. Camilla reminded the future king that their grandfather, the reigning monarch, had explicitly granted permission for the children to visit the castle that day, making William's aggressive use of security personnel a direct and insulting challenge to the sovereign authority of King Charles III himself. However, Camilla's outrage did not stop at the afternoon's immediate eviction. She used the confrontation to air deep-seated resentments that had been festering since the very beginning of the reign. She openly accused the Prince of Wales of orchestrating a calculated, multi-year campaign designed to systematically humiliate her and push her private family into the forgotten margins of the monarchy. The Queen Consort directly brought up the bitter dispute surrounding the coronation, accusing William of actively sabotaging her grandsons so they could not serve as official pages of honor, a snub that she felt was intended to publicly signal their inferior status. Furthermore, she furiously targeted William's unprecedented obsession with drawing strict boundaries around the inner circle of the monarchy. Camilla demanded to know why he felt entitled to alter centuries of court tradition by unilaterally dictating who could stand on the Buckingham Palace balcony during events like Trooping the Color, who received invitations to intimate family gatherings, and which specific individuals were allowed to position themselves close to the crown. To Camilla, these were not administrative adjustments for the modern era. They were deeply personal acts of hostility. She made it clear that she could no longer ignore the unmistakable signals William was sending to the public. By controlling the guest lists and curating the public face of the House of Windsor so aggressively, William was making her grandchildren look like disposable hangers-on rather than members of an integrated royal family. Camilla asserted that William's streamlined vision for the monarchy was nothing more than a convenient excuse to enact a personal vendetta, deliberately using his growing structural power to isolate her and ensure that the moment King Charles III was no longer here to protect them, the entire Parker Bowles and Lopes lineage would be entirely erased from royal life. To fully prove her point, Queen Camilla dug into the painful history of recent family gatherings, turning the confrontation into a direct trial of William's motives by unraveling what had happened behind the scenes at Sandringham. She forced the Prince of Wales to look back at the timeline, reminding him that during the Christmas celebrations of 2024, the inclusion of her extended family had been heralded as a massive, historic milestone. It was a moment of true integration, a public and private signal from the king that the Parker Bowles and Lopes families were finally being welcomed into the inner fold of the monarchy. Yet, that brief moment of acceptance was intentionally crushed just 1 year later. By December 2025, a sudden and cold decree from the palace machinery saw her 2 children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, completely vanish from the Sandringham guest list, a reality so stark and embarrassing that Tom was forced to publicly confirm his exclusion to the media. With deep bitterness, Camilla mocked the official explanation that the palace had fed to the press at the time, which claimed the gathering had been restricted to a small, private circle to focus entirely on family, while King Charles managed his cancer treatments. She looked directly at William and asked the cutting question of whose family they were actually talking about. To expose what she saw as blatant hypocrisy, the Queen Consort pointed directly to Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. She noted that despite the fact that their father, Prince Andrew, had been completely stripped of his royal titles and cast out of public life in late 2025 due to his catastrophic scandals, his daughters were still granted a seat at the sacred holiday table. Beatrice and Eugenie had chosen loyalty to the crown over their disgraced father, and they were rewarded with full inclusion, while her own children, who had done absolutely nothing wrong, were cast aside. Camilla asserted that this double standard proved the phrase family-focused was a weaponized lie used to mask a systematic campaign of exclusion. When William and his team spoke of family, they meant only the bloodline of the House of Windsor, treating her own relatives as disposable outsiders. The Queen Consort concluded that this sudden shift from the warmth of 2024 to the total banishment of late 2025 could not possibly be an accident. By linking the Christmas exclusion directly to the afternoon's dramatic eviction at Windsor, she argued that William was using his growing power to run a calculated campaign of discrimination. She ended her tirade with a blunt, aggressive question, demanding that the Thon Vung Su Wales look her in the eye and admit that he was intentionally targeting her and throwing her family out of the monarchy. Faced with the Queen Consort's intense emotional outburst, Prince William did not flinch, avoid her gaze, or offer a single diplomatic apology. Instead, he maintained a chilling composure, choosing to dismantle Camilla's arguments systematically, addressing each accusation one by one based strictly on the unyielding regulations and constitutional principles of the British monarchy. William did not engage in a subjective shouting match. To establish total control over the situation and demonstrate that this was an institutional matter rather than a personal feud, he stepped aside and allowed James, the Earl of Wessex, and Princess Anne to speak directly to the events that had unfolded that afternoon, forcing Camilla to confront the undeniable facts of her family's misconduct. James stepped forward first, presenting his report of the incident with the calm, rigid precision of a seasoned royal official. The young Earl explained to the Queen Consort that her grandchildren had directly breached the high-security perimeter of the Western private apartments, an area explicitly reserved for the state functions and private residence of the heir to the throne. James detailed how the children were running entirely wild, shouting through historic corridors without a single chaperone, royal protection officer, or nanny present to guide them. When James attempted to intervene and correct their path, the eldest grandson had openly ignored his authority, arrogantly assuming that his grandmother's title granted him total immunity to violate the security protocols of the castle. Princess Anne then cut through the tension, confirming that it was she, as the ultimate enforcer of palace discipline, who had ordered the immediate deployment of the Royal Protection Command to escort the unruly children from the premises. Anne made it clear that while King Charles may have granted permission for a social visit, that permission did not grant commoners the right to violate the physical boundaries of the sovereign estate or disrespect a titled member of the royal house. James had simply followed proper procedure, signing the official security incident log to create a permanent administrative record of the breach. Moving to Camilla's second grievance regarding the coronation, Prince William delivered a devastating defense of the ancient hierarchy of the crown. He reminded Camilla that the role of a page of honor is a historic, constitutional position traditionally reserved for the descendants of the royal bloodline or the children of high-ranking peers who owe direct allegiance to the throne. William stated bluntly that Camilla's aggressive attempt to displace Prince George, the future King of England, and the other young Vungtone with her own non-royal grandsons was a profound violation of royal protocol. He pointed out the toxic long-term consequences of her actions, noting that the king's past indulgence had so thoroughly blurred the lines that members of the British public had begun mistakenly addressing the Parker Bowles and Lopes children as royal highnesses. William looked at Camilla and asserted that such titles belong to the state and the Constitution, not to a grandmother's personal affections, and that he would never allow the unique sanctity of the royal bloodline to be diluted for the sake of domestic comfort.